The brothers had triumphed over the demon, forcing them to finally give up.
We shall accept your surrender, devil!
Cuphead laughed.
But we're not done just yet.
And with that, Cuphead and Mugman destroyed all the soul contracts, releasing Inkwell's Isle's residents from eternal servitude from the devil.
Gosh, I can't wait to tell everybody,
Cup said. The boys set off for home at top speed.
Come on, last one there's a leaky cup,
Mugman teased as they ran. Once home, the brothers gathered everyone together.
You're all free of the devil's debt,
Cuphead announced.
And that fiend won't bother us again,
Mugman added. The older kettle was literally brimming with pride as everyone began to cheer. Let's hear it for Cuphead and Mugman. Hip hip hurrah! Hip hip hurrah! I'm sorry that I beat all your asses earlier. As an all-day celebration began, the brothers promised to never wander into trouble again. And they didn't. Until the next time, of course. But that is another story. Hey, and that's the end of Cuphead. But not the end of Cuphead and Mugman themselves. I'm sure there'll be a sequel, which I actually hope that there are. There's a sequel. Our sincere appreciation to the members of our team whose loyalty and creative endeavor made possible this production. Again, I definitely strongly suggest if you're into this kind of thing, do a YouTube search for the animation talk Cuphead, or animation post-mortem Cuphead, something like that on YouTube, where the lead animation person, he talked about like the animation and how they did the animation, their thought process behind. It's like an hour-long talk, but it's pretty darn interesting. Even as someone who doesn't really, not planning on ever getting into the development side, I think it's very interesting to see how this all comes together. Anyway, so this is typically where I kind of talk about the game, give my off-the-cuff review, etc., etc. Overall, I think it was really good. I very much enjoyed it. Even as someone who's not necessarily very good at these side-scroller / side-scroller shooter type games. Is there another title for, like, another name for that? Because there's there's platformers like Super Meat Boy. But then there's games like this where there's the shooting aspect is a very central to it, but platforming is important too. I don't know. Anyway, but yeah, overall I enjoyed it. The controls were very good overall. I did have some what felt like a little wonkiness with the parry system. I talked about that at length, but in short, it felt like the hitboxes for enemies were vastly different, or at least the timings for parrying different enemies was vastly different. So, for example, on one enemy, I felt like I would hit it just where I think I need to hit it, and 99% of the time I would parry. But then there was other enemies, I would do the same thing and never parry. Typically, it did feel like the game was much more forgiving if you did the parry way ahead of time, like way before you really needed to, as opposed to waiting. And I'm used to waiting to the last second, thanks to games like Devil May Cry, Bayonetta, Neo, stuff like that. But I think it would definitely serve me and you better if you just parry before, parry way ahead of time. But other than that, the controls felt pretty good. The dash, the jump, it all felt pretty tight. There was no sliding when you land, any crap like that some games have that I absolutely loathe. So it was good in that respect. There wasn't a lot of really mechanics as far as that goes, to be fair. I mean, it's generally just, run, shoot, dash, jump, and that was pretty much it. There was no double jump, there was no wall gliding, there wasn't really any items you used. I mean, you had the charms, obviously, but those more gave you side benefits, like invulnerability when you dash, extra health, stuff like that. So on the mechanic side, it is it's not very in-depth, there's not much to it, but what is there, I felt like, for the most part, got used to good effect. Like, the boss fights were varied. Both they looked a lot different, they tended to be fairly different as well. I didn't feel like, oh, this is just a carbon copy of this other boss, for the most part. So I think, again, even though there wasn't a ton of different jumping mechanics and variations like wall sliding, stuff like that, I still, again, I really enjoyed what was there. And I think the game length was perfect for this type of thing too. Again, because if this game was like twice as long, it'd start to get a little old, right? Because you're not really expanding on anything. You're still kind of fighting bosses and side-scrolling stages. I feel like the length of this game was pretty much perfect. I Like, I feel like it was ready to come to an end. And again, I don't mean that in a, oh, I'm glad this game's over kind of way. I mean, I feel like this is a natural conclusion to the game. The bosses themselves, obviously, they almost all of them look great. They're all like, super weird. Like, you could never predict what the next phase was going to be because some of them were just completely unpredictable. Like, you know, the one woman who's a Zeppelin turning into half a moon and attacking you. Like, who would have guessed that? So there's that. And like I said, visually, they just look fantastic. I mean, everything visually in this game looked just phenomenal. The animations were just so smooth. I just love to just watch it. And again, it's seeing new bosses, watching their crazy animations, over the top transformation, stuff like that. All that was really, really cool. The music, sound effects, all great. Obviously, the music is great. Most of it is fitting pretty well in the themes, like the bosses and the stages. Sometimes it did feel a little off, but for the most part, I think the music was also just superbly done. Story-wise, I mean, it was enough to kind of get you going. I think it's interesting that while, you know, your characters look like the super nice guys, and obviously they are nice guys, you are actually kind of the bad guy in this role, right? You're actually doing the devil's work, literally doing the devil's work. I mean, you're kind of forced to do it, but you're still doing it, right? So I think that's a very interesting angle to go with. But otherwise, I mean, the story was nothing to write home about, but I don't think that was the focus either. It was enough to get you in the game and explain what you were doing. The shop and the items and stuff like that, I like that. I like the fact that you could, you know, really make sure to get all the coins on the stage, and that benefited you because that unlocked more unlocks. But they balanced that by saying you can only have one charm, 2 weapons at a time, 1 super at a time. I think it would have been a little bit broken if, well, it'd definitely been broken if you could just load them all up, like load all your charms up, load up all your weapons for every stage and whatnot. I think that was a good way to do it. That way, if you're not, you know, super great at platformers, you can probably get enough coins to get the guns and the charms that are going to work best for you. Stuff like spread, the homing fire, the extra hearts, which were huge, stuff like that. I feel like you're still going to be able to get those pretty easily without having to replay a stage because you missed 1 or 2 coins or what have you. As far as just kind of overall what I did and didn't like stage-wise, boss-wise, etc., I really wasn't crazy about the plane fights at all. I really don't like those types of fights, but I don't like that type of game, the Gradius, whatever you call it, style game, where you're in the jet or the spaceship or whatever, side-scrolling, basically shoot 'em ups. I don't really like shoot 'em ups, and they weren't like terrible, but I definitely did not like them. And generally speaking, they were my least favorite bosses. Like the second I saw I was in a plane, I was like, ugh. And again, they weren't terrible, but definitely my least favorite. I would have liked to seen less of those. Not just because of the plane aspect, but because like half of your upgrades that you bought now become useless, because all of your guns are useless because you only have the 1 or 2 guns that you have in the plane, and half of your charms aren't really useful for anything. Like the dash, invincibility dash is useless. Things like that. Obviously, you still get coffee and the hearts and whatnot, but the other stuff not so much. The free parry probably also didn't work. I don't imagine. That seemed like that would be broken then, because, well, semi-broken, because you could just parry everything. But yeah. So yeah, didn't like the side-scrolling stages. The items were interesting. I do feel like the hearts were vastly more powerful than everything else, especially if you're not great at these games. And honestly, if you're good at the games, then you don't really need the hearts anyway. The damage reduction that you dealt with because of the extra hearts were nothing compared to what the extra heart gave you, right? Again, where the extra heart, you can obviously live longer, but the side effect that's maybe not quite as obvious is you can live longer and see the further phases. And especially for like me, I need to live longer so I can see the phases, sometimes a few times, so that they stick in my head. It's like, okay, this is what happens then. This starts here. This is going to happen here. I need to be able to see that again, sometimes multiple times. And having that extra bit of health lets me get to living longer, so that I can see that. And again, for me personally, it's a huge benefit because I have little patience for redoing the same thing over and over again. So on these stages where there's like a bunch of phases and you have to keep redoing the beginning phases, and most often the beginning phases were like pretty trivial for the most part, especially when you've seen them a few times. So I would get bored doing those phases to get to the actual difficult phases, and I would get sloppy and take damage and get frustrated and restart and then do the same mistakes again because I'm just trying to go, okay, yes, I've seen this, let's go. This is the boring phase. I want to see the hard phase. And it would just kind of lead to a cycle of frustration. So the extra health was a huge boon to me there for sure. The invincibility dash, making you invisible, was honestly really fucking stupid. Like, I don't know if they did that as like a negative side effect of being invincible. And yes, I realize they called it invisible, but you wouldn't be invincible while you're invisible. You would just be invisible. You'd still get hit. So it feels like a really ham-fisted way to try to make the invincibility dash balanced. And honestly, it was, while the dash was good, it wasn't that insanely good that it needed to be balanced that way. Because I really need to be able to see my character. I don't have the dash distance memorized, especially when you're dashing around foreground areas, you're dashing off screen, or from the top of the screen. That makes it even worse, because you can't see your fucking self. So the invisibility was a huge negative, and maybe want to use that much, much less. I think that's kind of dumb. They should change that. Just make it invincibility. Like, make you go transparent or something so that you can see while you're invincible, not invisible, invincible. But don't go totally invisible. That's dumb. There was some, for the most part, I feel like the difficulty was difficult but fair. Like, they were throwing a lot at you, but it wasn't so much where you're typically having to make pixel perfect jumps. It wasn't randomized in such a way as that I felt that I didn't feel that there was a lot of times where I just flat out had to take damage because of the way the RNG worked. Sometimes I do think that happened, or I think that the RNG worked in such a way that unless you timed it 100% perfectly, because the way the multiple attacks of the bosses was working, you were going to take damage. I feel like that was pretty rare, pretty darn rare actually that happened. I very rarely felt like, if I would have planned this a little bit better, I could have avoided damage. Right, let me make sure I said that right. I felt like most often if I took damage, there was a way for me to have avoided it. I felt like even with the RNG stuff, I didn't feel like there was times where you're boxed in such a way that no matter what you do, you're going to get hit. Again, I felt like it happened sometimes, but it was pretty darn rare. They did resort to the cheap kills sometimes, which is a shame to see. Like shit in the foreground, like blocking your view. That's just lazy. I'm sorry. That's lazy difficulty. Why not just make the screen black sometimes? Like, again, that's just lazy difficulty. Don't do that. Too many developers fall back on that. And this game was designed good enough that you can see that they can design difficulty without resorting to cheap tricks, like bullshit like that. So don't do that. That was cheap. The other thing I didn't like was obviously the next to the last boss, the Dice King, or wait, was that his name? Don't mess with the shit. I don't know now. Anyway, you know what I'm talking about. That fight was bullshit. Like, there was just it committed the cardinal sin of boss fights. It was boring because redoing those beginning bosses over and over again, having to stare at the dice to try to get the optimal number. Otherwise, you're going to have to fight more bosses than you need, which means you're probably going to take more damage, which means you're probably not going to make it to the boss, or you're going to not make it through the boss because you have less health. That was awfully designed boss fight. Terrible. Like, not only all of those aspects, again, it's boring. It was incredibly boring boss fight. Once you've done the first few phases a few times and staring at that dice to try to figure out, to get your timing right, again, cardinal sin. It was just insanely boring. All the other fights, for the most part, I didn't feel were too bad. There were some that, and I do like that different fights seem to favor different weapons. I do like that you were encouraged that even though you might have one or two favorite weapons, I feel like some fights you really were kind of encouraged to use different weapons. Now, I do feel like the weapon balance was a bit off. I feel that by far the two best weapons are charge shots and the homing missiles. because homing missiles allows you to basically, for the most part, not completely, but mostly ignore damaging the boss. Just hold the button down and focus 100% on dodging. And while that might not seem to be a big deal, again, for somebody like me, that can actually help a ton because I'm not trying to multitask. I can be 100% focused on just dodging. So I do feel like that weapon is very high on the list of very good weapons because of that reason. And yes, it does do less damage, which I think is a good balance to it. So it does take longer, which of course increases your chances of getting hit. But I definitely think it's definitely top tier if you're not good at platformings. The charge shot, obviously, if you're good at platforming, is going to be the best weapon in the game, I would say. I've heard that's what speedrunners use, so I would say yes, it's the best weapon in the game if you're really good at the platforming stuff. Because you can take bosses down faster, and the damage difference was absolutely significant from what I could tell. Arguably, the spread shot is also pretty high up there as well. The problem with the spread shot is the distance that it could go was very short, and you had to hit with a lot of the bullets in order for it to even match the pea shooter. And again, I did test it a little bit off camera, and I know this is going on long, but anyway, I just like to talk about the game, so you can probably cut out now if you'd like. Thanks for watching, though. Anyway, I'm not going to go for too much longer. Anyway, the spread, again, yes, it could do more damage than the pea shooter, but again, I don't know how much of your bullets had to hit to match or exceed it, but it was a lot. And from my testing, the damage difference was it was very, very close, very marginal. And in a real boss fight where you're not going to be able to really be all up in the boss's shit the entire time, I feel like it was weaker. Now, of course, granted, you could just switch between spread shot and pea shooter, like when you can't get close enough for the spread shot. But honestly, if you're going to do that, just do the charge shot instead. Really, the only time I would ever suggest spread over charge shot is, for bosses anyway, typically, is if you're not very good at the charge timing. Like if I could see how maybe some people could struggle with remembering to let go of the button and remembering to charge it, stuff like that. Luckily, I played enough games where you kind of had to, you had to charge it while you're doing other stuff. I think that's the only reason I could do it consistently, or relatively consistently, to be honest, is I had a lot of practice over the years, like old Mega Man games, stuff like that. So I think that helped me a lot there. But yeah, that's the only other reason I would say to use spread is if you're not very good at doing the charge shot efficiently. The other good reason for the spread shot, though, was for run and guns, or if the boss had a lot of ads that could be difficult to shoot. In those situations, honestly, that's where I think the spread excels. Forget the bosses. Getting rid of ads, and again, the run and gun stages, I think it's really good for those. The lobber was, the damage on lobber is nice, but too often I found that the range is too crappy, and you spend too much of your time trying to stay at a very specific distance from the boss, or at a very specific angle. And sometimes you can't get to him at all without jumping, and again, that's going to hurt some of your DPS most likely, because you're going to be jumping, part of the time you're going to be too low to be hitting with the lob if you're having to jump. So lobber was probably the worst weapon in the game. I didn't try the roundabout or whatever it is. So, I mean, maybe that I have no idea about that one, obviously. And the pea shooter was a good default weapon. The weapon with damage was good. The control was okay. I hate that you were locked into 8 positions of shooting. That made shooting some enemies way tougher than it should have been because you didn't have fine control over your aim. I think that kind of sucks. But other than that, it was a good default weapon. I did feel like I was going back and using it. And honestly, I think that's the way default weapons should be. I don't think default weapons should just be garbage. I think it should still be, situational. But the problem with this game, again, is that kind of once you get the spread, not the spread, but once you get the charge and the homing, I feel like for bosses, those 2 weapons are definitely the best overall. The exception being maybe the dragon. The dragon was a lot easier with the lobber, because when you went into that phase with the fire parade or whatever, it was very easy to rain the globs down on him and do really good damage. But other than that, I can't think of a good boss for the lobber, even though I'm sure there is one. But anyway, let me wrap this up because I've been babbling on for too long. But overall, my thoughts, again, I think this is a great game. I really liked it. If you like platformers / platforming shooters at all, I'd say give it a try. I do feel like it is quite difficult, but I feel like if you persevere, you can beat it. And the stages are fairly short. Like if bosses were like 10 minutes long to defeat and you get to 9 minutes and die and have to do 9 minutes again, I would have quit this game a long time ago because I really had no patience for that. But most bosses were like, what, 1.5 to 2 minutes, sometimes 3 on the higher end to actually go from beginning to end. So I definitely say, try it out if you are like platformers at all. As far as a grade between 1 and 10, where a 10 is like ultimate, penultimate, amazing game. 5 is a game that's like has about equal amounts good, equal amounts bad. I would give this game, and I do use the full scale. I don't use the IGN scale where a game that's not very good gets a 7. I would say, it's really hard to say honestly right off the top of my head. I would say at least a 7.5. Off the top of my head, I'd say at least a 7.5. The music was great. The animations were phenomenal. I love just the whole visual audio experience alone was really cool. The variety of bosses, I like that it's something different. I don't play like pretty much any games that are mostly boss rushes with the side-scrolling levels in there to mix it up. So yeah, I'd say at least a 7.5, if not an 8. I think it was just a great game for what it is. And I don't really crazy about platformers. I don't even like platformers that much, and I really like this game a lot. As far as a price, basically I give a price that I think you should, basically the most you should pay for this game. Honestly, if you like platformers at all and think that you'll at least get about halfway through without like rage quitting or anything, honestly, full price. I think it's full price, like $20 or something, maybe 30. I'll try to remember. I think 30 might be the price with the soundtrack, which by the way, that's the one I bought because I like the soundtrack so much. But I think at most it's $30, I think. Unquestionably, I think if you're going to get at least halfway through this game, realistically, I think it's worth it. Absolutely. It's just, like I said, it's a really great experience overall. But yeah, absolutely, unquestionably worth full price, in my opinion. So yeah, thank you guys for watching. Hopefully you enjoyed this Let's Play. I didn't have quite as much rage as I thought I was until the casino boss, and then I feel like all of my rage from all the other bosses just culminated in that one. So I did pretty good on the salt levels for this playthrough. And I will say I'm surprised that the devil wasn't like insanely tedious / a pain in the ass, to be honest, after that one fight. But anyway, enough out of me. Thank you guys again for watching this all the way through. Make sure you leave your comments in the comment section below. Have you played this game? If so, what do you think? If you haven't played it yet, are you going to pick it up? Does it look fun? Did you enjoy? Were you mostly watching just because of the music and the visual style, the animation? I want to hear your thoughts below. And also, one more time, thanks again to Noth for your continued support on Patreon. Very much appreciate it. Make sure you guys subscribe to the channel and look out for the next Let's Play. I'll see you then.